I remember the exact sound the rain made that night. Not the heavy drumming of a storm, but something softer, more persistent. Like fingers tapping against glass, asking to be let in. The motel room sat just off Highway 83, one of those places that exists only because travelers need somewhere to sleep before pushing further into nowhere. The kind of place where the carpet has seen too much and the walls hold secrets they'll never tell. The room smelled like industrial detergent mixed with something I couldn't name. Maybe it was the lingering ghost of 1,000 other travelers, each leaving behind a piece of their story in the fibers of the bedding, the wood grain of the nightstand, the mirror that had reflected more confessions than a priest ever would. I had grown accustomed to these roadside sanctuaries over the months of traveling with Elias. They all blended together after a while, but this one would burn itself into my memory with surgical precision. We had arranged ourselves the way we always did, head to toe, a configuration that had become as natural as breathing since we started these work trips together. Practical, we told ourselves. Professional. Two grown men sharing space without crossing lines that neither of us had ever bothered to draw clearly. I lay with my head near the pillows, staring up at a ceiling that bore the water stains of some long-ago leak, patterns that looked almost deliberate in the dim light filtering through the thin curtains. Elias occupied the other end, his dark hair barely visible in my peripheral vision, his breathing steady but not quite the rhythm of sleep. The air conditioner hummed its mechanical lullaby, a white noise that should have been comforting but somehow amplified the silence between us instead. I found myself cataloging every sound. The distant hiss of tires on wet asphalt, the settling of the building around us, the soft rustle of fabric when one of us shifted position, my own heartbeat, which seemed unreasonably loud in the stillness. I had been lying awake for what felt like hours, though the digital clock on the nightstand stubbornly insisted it had only been 23 minutes since we turned off the lights. My mind wandered through the familiar territory of late-night thoughts. The insurance claim we had finished that day. The structural damage to the warehouse that would cost the company more than they wanted to pay. The drive home tomorrow. Evelyn waiting with her polite smile and carefully organized questions about my trip. The children, already asleep by the time I would walk through the door. But tonight, those thoughts felt hollow, like I was going through the motions of caring about a life that belonged to someone else. The wedding band on my finger had left its impression on the nightstand where I had placed it before lying down, a circle of gold that caught what little light crept in from the parking lot. I could see it from where I lay, a small but insistent reminder of the promises I had made and the man I was supposed to be. Elias moved then, a subtle shift that I felt more than saw. The mattress dipped slightly as he adjusted his position, and for a moment I thought he might be settling deeper into sleep. But then he turned, slowly, deliberately, until I could sense him facing me even in the darkness. The air between us seemed to thicken, charged with something I had been pretending not to notice for months. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, soft enough that it might have been my imagination if not for the way it made my chest tighten. He said he didn't want distance tonight. The words hung in the air between us like smoke, visible and substantial despite their weightlessness. I felt those words settle into me the way stones sink into still water, creating ripples that reached places I had taught myself not to acknowledge. My breath caught in my throat, and I was grateful for the darkness that had whatever expression had crossed my face. I could feel him waiting, not for an answer necessarily, but for some kind of acknowledgement that we had crossed into territory neither of us had mapped before. I didn't reply. Couldn't reply. Instead, I listened to the rain continuing its patient conversation with the window, felt the cool air from the unit washing over my skin, tasted the metallic tang of possibility on my tongue. My wedding ring seemed to pulse with its own light from the nightstand, a beacon calling me back to shore even as I felt myself drifting into deeper waters. The silence stretched between us, but it was different now. Not empty, but full of all the things we weren't saying. I could hear Elias breathing, could sense the careful way he was holding himself still, giving me space to process what he had offered. Or confessed. Or requested. I wasn't sure which, and maybe it didn't matter. My throat felt dry, and I swallowed carefully, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet room. I thought about all the nights we had shared space like this, professional and proper, each of us maintaining our designated territory on the mattress. I thought about the conversations we had shared during long drives, the comfortable silences, the way he made me coffee exactly the way I liked it without ever asking how. I thought about the careful distance I had maintained, the lines I had drawn not just around the bed but around my thoughts, my glances, my awareness of him as anything more than a colleague. But lying there in that anonymous room, listening to him breathe just feet away from me, I realized that all my careful boundaries had been nothing more than theater. A performance for an audience of one, designed to convince myself that what I felt was manageable, controllable, safely categorized as friendship enhanced by proximity and shared purpose. The rain picked up slightly, tapping more insistently against the glass, and I closed my eyes against the sound of my own pulse thundering in my ears. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on us both, the sense that whatever happened next would determine something fundamental about who we were and who we might become. The smell of detergent seemed stronger now, mixed with something warmer, more human. The scent of possibility, perhaps, or simply the recognition that we were no longer pretending to be asleep. I had always been good at compartments. Work lived in one space, marriage in another, the vague longings I sometimes felt late at night tucked away in a corner I rarely visited. It was a system that had served me well for 38 years, keeping everything orderly and manageable. But lying there in that motel room, I felt those carefully constructed walls beginning to show cracks. Elias had been my travel partner for 8 months now. 8 months of shared rental cars and adjacent airplane seats and rooms exactly like this one. 8 months of professional courtesy gradually softening into something that felt dangerously close to intimacy. Not the kind of intimacy I shared with Evelyn, which had become as predictable as sunrise, but something rawer, uncharted. The kind that crept up on you during long silences on empty highways, or when you discovered that someone made their coffee exactly the way you did, or when you found yourself looking forward to Monday mornings because they meant another week of traveling together. I had told myself it was friendship, male bonding, the natural result of spending so much time in close quarters with someone who was both competent and easy to be around. Elias never complained about my habit of leaving the bathroom light on all night, and I never mentioned that he talked in his sleep sometimes, muttering fragments of conversations I couldn't quite piece together. We had developed our own rhythm, our own shorthand, our own unspoken agreements about space and privacy in the delicate dance of two people learning to exist in each other's orbit. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the carefully maintained distance between us seemed less like consideration and more like fear. I could sense Elias still facing me, could feel the weight of his attention even in the darkness. The space between us, maybe 3 feet of cooling air and cheap cotton bedding, felt both vast and gossamer thin. I imagined I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, though I knew that was impossible. The human body simply doesn't generate enough heat to bridge that kind of distance. Or maybe it does, and I had just never paid attention before. I thought about Evelyn, asleep in our bedroom 300 miles away. She would be lying on her side, facing the window, her breathing deep and even. She had always been a good sleeper, able to slip into unconsciousness as easily as stepping through a doorway. I envied that ability. I had spent more nights than I could count staring at our ceiling, listening to her breathe, feeling like a stranger in my own life. Our marriage wasn't unhappy, exactly. It simply was. We had built something stable and respectable, a life that looked good from the outside and functioned smoothly on the inside. We shared responsibilities and made decisions together and presented a united front to the world. But somewhere along the way, we had stopped reaching for each other. Maybe we never had, really. Maybe what I had mistaken for love was just compatibility, two people who wanted similar things and were willing to work together to achieve them. The thought should have bothered me more than it did. The fact that it didn't, that I could lie in a motel room 300 miles from my wife and feel more present than I had in months, told me everything I needed to know about the state of my marriage. And maybe about the state of my heart. I shifted slightly, and the mattress springs creaked in protest. Such a small sound, but in the quiet of the room it seemed to echo. I held my breath, waiting to see if the noise would prompt Elias to speak again, to break the charged silence that had settled over us like a blanket. But he remained still, though I could sense his alertness, the way his breathing had become too careful to be natural. The air conditioner cycled off, leaving us in a silence so complete it felt solid. Now I could hear everything. The rain against the window, steadier now but still gentle. The distant hum of traffic on the highway, sparse at this hour but constant. The soft whisper of air moving through the room. And underneath it all, the sound of two people trying very hard not to make any noise while everything around them shifted. I wondered what would happen others' company. We were two people who had discovered in each other a possibility for connection that we had stopped believing was available to us. The conversation continued deep into the night, moving through subjects that included our fears about aging, our regrets about paths not taken, our hopes for kinds of fulfillment that seemed to exist just beyond our current circumstances. When we finally prepared for sleep, I understood that something had been established between us that could not be easily categorized or dismissed. We had been lying in our respective beds for perhaps an hour when the storm arrived. Not the gentle rain that had accompanied many of our previous conversations, but a serious weather event with thunder that seemed to shake the motel's foundation and lightning that turned the thin curtains into intermittent spotlights. I was lying awake, listening to the storm and thinking about what Elias had shared about loneliness and connection when I heard him move. It was a subtle shift at first, the kind of adjustment that people make in their sleep. But then he turned more deliberately, and I could sense him facing me across the small space that separated our beds. The storm intensified, and in the brief illumination provided by lightning flashes, I could see that Elias was indeed looking in my direction. Neither of us spoke for several minutes, both of us listening to the rain against the windows and the rolling thunder that seemed to be moving closer rather than farther away. It was then that he said it, his voice barely audible above the sound of the storm, but clear enough that I could not mistake his words or their meaning. He said he didn't want distance tonight. The sentence fell into the space between us like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that reached every corner of the room. I lay there in the darkness, feeling my heart rate accelerate and my breathing become shallow. Everything we had been building toward during these weeks of extended trips and intimate conversations had crystallized into this moment of choice. Elias was offering something that went beyond our careful friendship, something that would require me to step outside the safe boundaries I had maintained throughout my adult life. I didn't move immediately. Couldn't move. The implications of his words seemed to expand in the darkness, encompassing not just this night, but everything that might follow from whatever choice I made in response. My marriage, my children, my career, the carefully constructed life I had built around the principle of stability and responsibility. All of it seemed to hang in the balance as I lay there listening to the storm and feeling the weight of possibility pressing down on me. But I also didn't say no. Didn't retreat into the professional distance that had characterized our relationship for so many months. Didn't offer the kind of gentle rejection that would have allowed us both to pretend this moment had never happened. Instead, I remained still and present, letting his words settle into the space between us while the storm continued its conversation with the windows and the darkness held us both in its embrace. What happened next would depend on choices that neither of us had fully prepared for, but that both of us seemed ready to make. The storm continued its assault on the windows while we lay in the darkness, neither of us moving to break the spell that Elias's words had cast over the room. I could hear him breathing in the careful way that indicated wakefulness rather than sleep, and I knew he was waiting for some kind of response to what he had offered. Gradually, so slowly that it might have been my imagination, I began to shift my position on the narrow motel bed. Not dramatically, but a subtle reorientation that brought me from lying on my back to lying on my side, facing the space where I knew he was waiting in his own bed. The movement was small enough that it could have been dismissed as unconscious adjustment, but we both understood that I was not asleep. The shift in my position was a form of communication, a tentative acknowledgement that I was willing to engage with whatever was developing between us. In the brief illumination provided by lightning flashes, I could see that Elias had also turned to face me. We were separated by perhaps 3 feet of space and 2 different mattresses, but the quality of attention that passed between us made the distance feel both vast and negligible. We remained in this position as the storm gradually moved away, the thunder becoming more distant and the lightning less frequent. The rain continued against the windows, but with less urgency, settling into the steady rhythm that had accompanied so many of our previous conversations. But tonight felt different from all those other nights. charged with a possibility that neither of us had explicitly acknowledged, but both of us had been moving toward for weeks. It was then that Elias moved, a shift so gradual that it took me several moments to realize what was happening. He was extending his arm across the space between our beds, reaching toward me with the kind of careful deliberation that suggested he was giving me time to object or withdraw if I chose to do so. His movement was not aggressive or demanding. It carried no implication of entitlement beyond the simple desire for contact. He was offering his hand, his touch, as a question rather than a statement, leaving me free to respond according to my own comfort and desire. When his fingers finally made contact with mine, the touch was so light that it might have been accidental if not for the intentionality with which he had moved to create it. The sensation was electric in a way that seemed disproportionate to the actual physical contact involved. His fingertips brushed against the back of my hand with pressure so gentle that I could have easily missed it if I hadn't been paying such careful attention. I should have pulled away. Every rational part of my mind understood that this moment represented a crossing of boundaries that would fundamentally alter not just our working relationship, but my understanding of myself and what I wanted from my life. I was a married man with children and responsibilities, someone who had built his identity around reliability and careful choices. But I didn't withdraw my hand. Instead, I found myself responding to his touch with a subtle movement of my own, turning my palm upward so that our fingers could interweave in a gesture that was both innocent and profoundly intimate. The contact created a circuit of warmth between us that seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to something deeper and more essential. We remained connected like this as the storm finally passed, and the room settled into the kind of deep quiet that comes in the hours before dawn. Neither of us spoke, but we both understood that something irreversible had occurred between us. The careful distance we had maintained for so many months had been replaced by a connection that was both physical and emotional. Sleep, when it finally came, was unlike anything I had experienced during our previous trips together. Instead of lying carefully separated in our respective spaces, we remained facing each other with our hands connected across the divide between our beds. I was conscious of his breathing settling into the deeper rhythm of rest, aware of the way his fingers relaxed, but never completely released their hold on mine. Morning arrived slowly, announced by gradual lightening of the curtains. I woke to find that our hands had separated at some point during the night, though we remained facing each other across the small space between our beds. Elias was still asleep, his face relaxed into an expression of peace that I rarely saw during his waking hours. When Elias finally woke, our eyes met immediately, as if we had both been waiting for this moment of conscious recognition. Neither of us spoke for several long moments, but the look that passed between us carried the weight of acknowledgement about what we had discovered in each other. The drive back to the office was quiet, a different kind of silence than we had shared before. There was a tension that had everything to do with the weight of unspoken recognition. We both understood that what had happened between us would need to be addressed eventually, but neither of us seemed ready for that conversation in the harsh light of morning. It was during this drive that I became conscious of my wedding ring in a way that I hadn't experienced since the early years of my marriage. The band felt heavier on my finger, more substantial somehow, as if the events of the previous night had increased its physical weight. I found myself twisting it around my finger with nervous energy, a habit I had developed during stressful moments but hadn't engaged in for years. When we reached the office, I made some excuse about needing to clean up before starting work and headed directly to the men's restroom. I needed a moment alone to process what had happened and to prepare myself for the return to normal professional interaction. Standing in front of the mirror above the sinks, I saw someone who looked fundamentally the same as the person who had left for this trip several days earlier. But there was something in my expression that suggested internal changes, a recognition of possibilities that I had spent years avoiding. It was in that moment, looking at my reflection in the harsh fluorescent light, that I finally allowed myself to acknowledge what I had been trying not to see for months. What I felt for Elias was not simply friendship or professional respect. It was attraction, desire, love, perhaps, though that word carried implications I wasn't ready to fully explore. The admission was both liberating and terrifying. For the first time in my adult life, I was acknowledging feelings that went against every assumption I had made about myself. I had never questioned my sexual orientation, had never felt anything for another man that went beyond casual friendship. My marriage to Evelyn, my role as husband and father, had all seemed to confirm a straightforward understanding of who I was. I thought back over our relationship, searching for signs that I had missed or misinterpreted. The way I had looked forward to our trips together with anticipation that went beyond professional interest. The attention I paid to details about him that had nothing to do with work. The comfortable silences, the intimate quality of our conversations, the way his presence had become necessary to my sense of well-being. All of these things took on new meaning in light of what I was finally allowing myself to acknowledge. What I had told myself was friendship had always contained elements of something deeper. The longing I had felt during quiet moments, the dissatisfaction I experienced when returning home from our trips, all of it pointed to feelings that I had been too frightened to recognize. 3 weeks later, we received another assignment that required overnight travel. A hotel fire in a mountain town that had damaged several adjoining buildings, the kind of complex assessment that justified extended investigation. I accepted the assignment with professional demeanor, but internally I was aware that this trip would be different from all the others we had taken together. The drive to the mountains was quiet, both of us seemingly lost in thoughts that we weren't ready to share. But there was an undercurrent of anticipation that was impossible to ignore, a sense that we were approaching some kind of reckoning that had been delayed but not avoided. We worked late that night, analyzing the complex damage patterns that the fire had created. Our collaboration was as seamless as it had always been, but I was conscious of his presence beside me with an intensity that made concentration difficult. Every accidental contact, every glance that lingered slightly longer than necessary, all of it seemed to carry weight that had nothing to do with insurance assessments. I lay awake for perhaps an hour, listening to Elias breathe and thinking about courage and choice and the ways that our deepest truths sometimes emerge only when we stop fighting against them. The touch we had shared during our previous trip had opened something between us that could not be easily closed. It was then that I made the choice that would change everything. Without allowing myself time to reconsider, I rose from my bed and crossed the small space that separated us. Elias was awake, and his eyes met mine as I approached his bed. I sat down carefully on the edge of his mattress, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. For several long moments, we simply looked at each other in the dim light, both of us understanding that we had reached a point where words would be inadequate to express what we were feeling. When I finally leaned toward him, it was with careful deliberation. The kiss began tentatively, almost experimentally, as if we were both testing the reality of what we had been feeling against the actual experience of physical contact. The sensation of kissing him was both familiar and completely foreign. Familiar because it felt like something I had been wanting for months without acknowledging it. Foreign because it challenged every assumption I had made about myself and what I desired. The kiss deepened gradually, becoming more urgent as we both allowed ourselves to acknowledge the depth of what we had been feeling. There was something desperate in the way we held each other, as if we were trying to make up for months of careful distance in a single moment of connection. When we finally separated, we were both breathing heavily, and I could see in his eyes the same mixture of wonder and apprehension that I was feeling. We had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, had acknowledged something between us that would require us to make choices about our futures that neither of us had been prepared to consider. Neither of us spoke for a long time after that kiss. We simply held each other in the dim light of the motel room, processing what had happened and what it might mean for everything else in our lives. I was conscious of the way his heart was beating against my chest, of the warmth of his skin, of the fact that this moment of intimacy felt more honest than anything I had experienced in years. When I finally arrived home that evening, I went through the familiar rituals of domestic life with the same careful attention I had always shown. I greeted Evelyn with appropriate warmth, listened to the children's accounts of their days, helped with homework and bedtime routines. But underneath all of these normal activities, I carried the weight of what had happened with Elias and the knowledge that my life was no longer as straightforward as it had seemed just days before. It was while I was standing in Lucy's doorway, watching her sleep with the peaceful abandon that belongs only to children, that I fully understood the complexity of what I had set in motion. She lay curled beneath her blankets, surrounded by the stuffed animals and books that defined her 8-year-old world, completely trusting that the adults in her life would continue to provide the stability and security that allowed her to sleep so peacefully. Looking at her, I realized that the lie I had been living was no longer just my own. My growing feelings for Elias, the recognition of desires I had never acknowledged, the kiss that had confirmed everything I had been trying to deny, all of it had implications that extended far beyond my own happiness or self-discovery. Whatever choices I made going forward would affect not just me and Evelyn, but these two innocent people who had done nothing to deserve the upheaval that might be coming. The weight of that responsibility settled over me like a physical presence, and I understood that I was facing decisions that would require more courage than I had ever been asked to demonstrate before. The conversation with Evelyn took place on a Thursday evening in early April, nearly 3 weeks after the kiss that had changed everything about my understanding of myself. I had spent those weeks moving through the familiar rhythms of domestic routine while carrying the weight of a decision I knew I could no longer postpone. The children were in bed, the house settled into quiet. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, working on something related to the nonprofit where she volunteered organizing fundraising events. She had always been good at managing multiple responsibilities simultaneously, her attention divided between the spreadsheet on her screen and the countless small tasks that kept our household functioning smoothly. I stood in the doorway for several minutes, watching her work with the same efficient competence she brought to everything in her life. There was something peaceful about the scene, something that spoke to the stable partnership we had built together over 11 years of marriage. But looking at her bent over her computer, her reading glasses reflecting the blue light from the screen, I felt the familiar sense of distance that had characterized our relationship for years. I approached the table slowly, my heart beating with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the simple act of sitting down beside my wife. When I pulled out the chair next to hers, she looked up with the polite attention she gave to most interruptions, expecting perhaps a question about the children's schedules or a reminder about some upcoming obligation. Instead, I sat there for a moment in silence, trying to find words for something I had never imagined I would need to say. The kitchen around us held the accumulated weight of 11 years of shared meals and quiet conversations, of morning coffee routines and late-night discussions about the 1,000 small decisions that had shaped our life together. Finally, I spoke, and there was a tremor in my voice that I couldn't quite control. I told her that I hadn't been honest with myself, and I hadn't been honest with her either. The words came out slowly, each one carefully chosen, as if I were navigating a conversation in a language I was still learning to speak. Evelyn set down her pen and closed her laptop with deliberate precision that suggested she understood this was not going to be a brief interruption. She turned to face me fully, and I could see in her expression a mixture of wariness and resignation, as if she had been expecting this conversation for longer than either of us had been willing to acknowledge. I continued talking, trying to explain feelings that I didn't entirely understand myself. I told her about the restlessness I had been carrying for years, the sense that I was living someone else's life rather than my own. I spoke about the loneliness I felt even when surrounded by the people who were supposed to be closest to me. She listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap, her face showing careful neutrality. But there was something different in her attention this time, a quality of focus that suggested she understood we were discussing something more fundamental than the usual marital dissatisfactions. When I finally stopped talking, the silence stretched between us for what felt like several minutes. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the corner, the settling sounds of our house around us, the distant noise of traffic on the street outside. Finally, Evelyn spoke, and her voice was steady despite the complexity of what she was asking. She wanted to know if this was about Elias. Not accusatory, not angry, Just a simple question that cut directly to the heart of what I had been trying to say. I nodded, unable to find words for an admission that felt both necessary and devastating. Yes, it was about Elias, but it was also about much more than that. It was about recognizing desires I had never acknowledged, about understanding that the life I had built was founded on assumptions about myself that were no longer sustainable. Her silence after my confirmation lasted so long that I began to wonder if she was going to respond at all. She sat there looking at her hands, and I found myself studying her profile in the soft light from the pendant lamp above our table. When she finally spoke again, her words surprised me with their gentleness and their accuracy. She said that she had always known there was a part of me that she couldn't reach, a place where I existed that felt fundamentally separate from our shared life together. She had attributed it to my personality, to the natural reserve that characterized the way I moved through the world, but now she understood that it might have been something else entirely. There was no anger in her voice, no accusation or hurt feelings expressed in the dramatic way that I might have expected from such a conversation. Instead, there was a kind of sad recognition, as if she was acknowledging something she had suspected for longer than either of us had been willing to admit. We talked for another hour after that, moving carefully through the practical implications of what my admission meant for our marriage and our family. The conversation had a surreal quality, as if we were discussing arrangements for someone else's life rather than dismantling the structure that had defined our adult existence for more than a decade. Evelyn proved to be as competent at managing the logistics of separation as she was at everything else. We discussed custody arrangements and financial responsibilities with the same methodical attention we had always brought to major decisions. She would keep the house to provide stability for the children. I would find an apartment nearby so that Lucy and David could easily move between our homes. There were no tears during this conversation, no dramatic declarations or accusations. We simply acknowledged that what we had built together was no longer sustainable given what I had discovered about myself, and we began the careful work of determining how to dismantle it with as little damage as possible to the people we both loved. The actual process of separation unfolded over the following weeks with quiet efficiency. I found a modest one-bedroom apartment about 15 minutes from our house, close enough that the children could ride their bikes to visit, but far enough away that Evelyn and I wouldn't constantly encounter each other. Moving my belongings felt like archaeology, each box representing a different layer of the life I had constructed around the assumption that I was someone I was apparently not. Books I had accumulated but rarely read, clothes that reflected the image I had tried to project rather than who I actually was, photographs that documented family vacations that now seemed to belong to someone else's story. The children handled the transition with the resilience that people always attribute to young people, but which I suspected was really a form of shock. Lucy asked practical questions about schedules and logistics, her 8-year-old mind trying to organize this new reality into categories she could understand. David retreated into careful observation, studying the adults around him with the attention of someone trying to understand rules that weren't being explicitly explained. I tried to explain the separation in terms that would make sense to them without burdening them with complexity. Their father was going through some changes, I told them, and sometimes adults needed space to figure out who they were supposed to be. They would still see me regularly, still have the stability and love they had always known, but the configuration of our family would be different going forward. Elias and I had not spoken directly about my separation, though I suspected he was aware of the changes through subtle alterations in my daily routine that colleagues notice even when they don't comment directly. I had started arriving at work earlier and staying later, partly because my empty apartment didn't provide the same incentive to maintain regular hours that family obligations had created. Our professional relationship continued with the same competent collaboration that had always characterized our work together, but there was an undercurrent of awareness that made every interaction feel charged with significance. We were both careful to maintain appropriate boundaries, understanding that my personal situation was too complex and fragile to support the kind of relationship we had begun to develop during our final trips together. For several months, we existed in a state of careful suspension, working together during the day and returning to our separate lives in the evening without acknowledging the connection that had precipitated such dramatic changes in my domestic arrangements. I needed time to understand who I was outside the context of marriage and family responsibilities, and Elias seemed to respect that need without requiring explanations or assurances about what might develop between us in the future. My apartment became a laboratory for discovering what I actually wanted when freed from the expectations that had shaped my choices for so many years. I found myself reading books I had been meaning to explore for decades, listening to music that reflected my own taste rather than what seemed appropriate for family consumption, cooking meals that pleased me rather than accommodating the preferences of people who depended on me. The solitude was both liberating and occasionally overwhelming. After years of constant background noise provided by children and domestic obligations, the silence sometimes felt oppressive rather than peaceful. But gradually, I began to appreciate the luxury of existing without performance, of moving through my days guided by my own rhythms. I saw Lucy and David according to the custody arrangement Evelyn and I had established, and these visits provided a different kind of pleasure than the routine interactions of our previous family life. Without the pressure of maintaining household order, I could focus entirely on their company, really listening to their stories and observations. It was during one of these custody visits, about 4 months after my separation from Evelyn, that Lucy asked me directly if I was lonely in my new apartment. The question surprised me with its directness and its insight into emotional territory that I hadn't expected an 8-year-old to navigate so perceptively. I told her that sometimes I was lonely, but that I was also learning things about myself that I hadn't understood before, and that sometimes people needed to be alone for a while before they could figure out how to be with other people in the right way. She nodded with the serious expression she wore when processing important information, and then asked if I thought I would live alone forever. I told her that I didn't know, but that whatever happened, she and David would always be the most important people in my life, and that any future choices I made would include consideration for their happiness and stability. It was 2 weeks after this conversation that Elias and I finally acknowledged directly what had been developing between us for so many months. He suggested that we have dinner together, not as colleagues extending a work conversation, but as two people who needed to address what had been left unspoken since my marriage ended. We met at a small diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that catered to travelers and locals who wanted simple food served without pretension. The interior was worn but clean, with vinyl booths and fluorescent lighting that created the kind of anonymous atmosphere where important conversations could unfold without pressure. Elias arrived a few minutes after me, and when he slid into the booth across from where I was waiting, the familiarity of his presence created an immediate sense of rightness that I had been missing during our months of careful professional distance. We ordered coffee and pie from a server who seemed indifferent to our presence, and then sat looking at each other across the narrow table while we tried to find words for feelings that had been suspended for too long. The conversation began tentatively, both of us aware that we were entering territory that could fundamentally alter our relationship in ways that couldn't be easily reversed. Elias spoke about the months since my separation, how difficult it had been to maintain professional boundaries while wanting to offer support. I described the process of learning to live alone, the discoveries I had made about my own preferences and needs when freed from the obligations of maintaining someone else's vision of domestic happiness. Gradually, we moved toward more direct acknowledgement of what we meant to each other and what we might want to build together. Neither of us was ready for the kind of commitment that my marriage had represented, but we both understood that what we shared was too significant to continue ignoring indefinitely. As we talked, our hands came to rest on the table between us, not quite touching but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable to anyone else in the restaurant, but it felt like a declaration of intention, a willingness to begin something new without the certainty of knowing exactly where it might lead. When we finally left the diner that evening, we had established the beginning of something that was neither the careful friendship we had maintained at work nor the intense connection we had discovered during our final trips together. Instead, It was something more tentative and more honest, a relationship built on the recognition that both of us had work to do in understanding ourselves before we could offer anything lasting to each other. But sitting in that anonymous diner with Elias across from me and our hands resting side by side on the worn Formica table, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not the desperate longing that had characterized my final months of marriage, but a quiet sense of possibility, a recognition that there were ways of being with another person that I was only beginning to discover. We walked to our cars together through the parking lot, and when we reached the point where we would separate to return to our respective homes, Elias paused and looked at me with the kind of direct attention that had characterized all our most important moments together. He told me that he was willing to take things slowly, to build something together at whatever pace felt sustainable given the complexity of our situations. He understood that I needed time to discover who I was outside the context of marriage and family obligations, and he was prepared to wait while I did that work. I thanked him for his patience and told him that I couldn't promise what our relationship might become, but that I was grateful for the possibility of finding out. We didn't kiss that night, didn't make any dramatic declarations or commitments that might have felt premature given how much we both still needed to learn about ourselves. Instead, we simply acknowledged that we were beginning something new together, something that honored both the connection we had discovered and the time we needed to understand what that connection might mean for our individual futures. It was a beginning rather than a conclusion, an opening toward possibility rather than a resolution of all the questions that had brought us to this point. Driving home to my apartment that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was much younger. Excitement about the future that was based on genuine choice rather than obligation. Anticipation that emerged from my own desires rather than external expectations. Whatever happened next would require courage and honesty in ways I was still learning to practice, but it would be mine in a way that nothing had been mine for longer than I could remember. The apartment on Maple Street was nothing like the temporary space I had occupied during the first months of my separation. Where that place had felt like a way station, this new home carried the weight of intentional choice. Elias and I had found it together during a weekend in late spring, walking through empty rooms and imagining how they might hold the life we were carefully building between us. It was a second-floor unit in a converted Victorian house, with hardwood floors that creaked in familiar places and windows that caught the morning light in ways that made ordinary moments feel significant. We had moved in on a Saturday in June, nearly a year after that first conversation at the diner where we had acknowledged what we meant to each other. The children had met him properly during a custody visit in early spring. Lucy had interrogated him with her characteristic directness, wanting to know about his work and his opinions on subjects ranging from space exploration to dog training. David had observed him with careful attention, eventually warming to Elias's quiet presence and his willingness to listen to detailed explanations about whatever building project currently occupied his interest. Both children seemed to accept Elias as a natural extension of the changes that had already altered their family structure. What mattered to them was that their father seemed more present and more genuinely happy than he had been in the final years of our previous family configuration. The apartment on Maple Street reflected the particular kind of domesticity that Elias and I had created together. It was sparse but lived in, furnished with pieces we had chosen for their functionality. The kitchen counter held 2 coffee mugs that had become our habitual choices, his blue ceramic and mine white with a chip near the handle. In the bathroom, 2 toothbrushes stood in a glass beside the sink, a small symbol of the ordinary intimacies that had grown between us. Our relationship had settled into patterns that felt both familiar and entirely new. We shared morning coffee and evening meals, but we also maintained individual routines that kept us from falling into the kind of merged existence that had characterized my marriage to Evelyn. We gave each other space when solitude felt necessary, and we came together in the comfortable silences and easy conversations that had first drawn us to each other. It was in this context that I woke up alone on a Tuesday morning in October, nearly 4 months after we had begun living together full-time. Elias had left early for a flight to Chicago, where he would spend 3 days documenting flood damage at a manufacturing facility. These separations had become routine parts of our working lives, brief interruptions that made our reunions feel both natural and precious. The bed beside me still held the impression of his body, the sheets wrinkled in the particular way that suggested someone had recently been sleeping there. I could smell the faint trace of his soap on the pillow, a scent that had become as familiar to me as my own breathing. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting patterns across the hardwood floor that seemed to shift with the movement of the trees outside our windows. It was then that I noticed the folded piece of paper on the pillow beside me, positioned where his head had been when we fell asleep the night before. I recognized his handwriting immediately, the careful block letters that he used for notes and reports, and the occasional lists of tasks that helped him organize his days. The paper was ordinary notebook stock, torn carefully from a pad he kept on the nightstand for recording thoughts that occurred to him in the moments between waking and sleep. I unfolded the note slowly, already smiling at whatever gentle observation or practical reminder he might have left for me to discover. But the words I found were more significant than I had expected, a reference to the earliest days of our professional relationship and a recognition of how far we had traveled from those careful boundaries we had once maintained. The note said simply, "You don't have to sleep head to toe anymore." I lay there holding the paper and thinking about the first night we had shared a motel room, the awkward negotiation of space, and the careful attention we had paid to maintaining appropriate distance. We had been so careful then, so committed to the idea that what we shared was purely professional, that the comfort we found in each other's presence was simply a byproduct of working closely together. Now, lying in the bed we shared every night, I could trace the gradual evolution that had brought us from that original configuration to this morning of easy intimacy and gentle humor. We had learned to face each other rather than maintain careful separation, had discovered that proximity could be a source of comfort rather than anxiety, had built something together that honored both our individual needs and our shared desire for connection. I folded the note carefully and placed it on the nightstand beside the lamp we had bought together during our second week in the apartment. Outside, the morning was progressing toward the time when I would need to rise and prepare for another day at the office, but for now I allowed myself the luxury of simply lying in the warmth that Elias had left behind. I pressed my hand to the place where he had been sleeping, feeling the residual heat that his body had left in the sheets. The sensation was both comforting and somehow profound, a physical reminder of the intimacy we had created and the trust that allowed us to be vulnerable with each other night after night. In a few hours, he would be in Chicago, documenting other people's losses and calculating the costs of rebuilding what had been damaged. I looked toward the window where the morning light was growing stronger, warming the floor between our bed and the dresser. The light had a quality that seemed particular to autumn mornings, clear and golden in a way that made familiar objects appear more significant. This apartment, these rooms, this life we had created together, none of it resembled what I had imagined when I was younger. The marriage I had built with Evelyn, the role I had performed as a conventional husband and father, the careful distance I had maintained from my own desires, all of that belonged to someone else now, someone I remembered with compassion but no longer needed to be. What I had now was simpler and more complex simultaneously. Simpler because it was built on honesty about who I actually was rather than who I thought I should be. More complex because it required ongoing attention and communication rather than automatic behaviors. But lying there in the bed I shared with Elias, holding his note and feeling the warmth he had left behind, I understood that complexity was not the same as difficulty. What we had together required intention and care, but it also provided a kind of satisfaction that I had spent years not knowing I was missing. I took a breath then, deep and slow, feeling the air fill my lungs and then release into the quiet of our bedroom. The breath felt different than the careful, controlled breathing that had characterized so many years of my adult life. This was the breath of someone who was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what felt right, living in a way that honored both his obligations to other people and his own fundamental needs. It was the breath of someone who was free. Eventually, I would need to rise and shower and dress for work. In a few days, Elias would return from Chicago with stories about the flood damage and observations about the resilience of the people whose businesses had been affected. We would resume the ordinary rhythms of our shared life, the morning coffee and evening conversations, the comfortable silences and easy laughter that had become the foundation of everything we were building together. But for now, in this moment of solitude and reflection, I simply lay in the warmth that love had left behind and breathed in the knowledge that I was finally living a life that belonged entirely to me. The morning light continued to strengthen outside our windows, and I closed my eyes and let myself be completely present in the gratitude that had become the dominant emotion of my days. I was home,